Thanks for checking out this video. In it, we're going to discuss the Simpson Seatiger 555 mechanical windlass. It's different from a lot of windlasses these days because it's mechanically powered. Use your arm strength. You don't need batteries. You don't need long, expensive copper cables. I've already taken it apart, and I recently got this back from a powder coater, so it looks clean. I'll show you some pictures of what it looked like when we got it. But I want to show you how it goes back together. Through it step by step. There's several dozen parts, so it gets a little confusing, but I think this will make it easier for any of you out there that might have an old one of these that wants to put it back together. Disassembling the windlass can be quite a challenge. It took me several days, and I had the luxury of working in a shop with all the tools that I needed at my fingertips. Some of you may be working in a boatyard or may not have all the tools handy, so I want to give you a couple tips to help your process. First is have a tub and a lot of mineral spirits, paper towel, rubber gloves, and some brushes, because everything that you take out will need to be cleaned. It'll be very greasy and grimy. As far as tools, you're going to need a 19mm, 17mm, and 10mm wrench. I use combination wrenches and socket wrenches. You're also going to need a 7 or a 13mm wrench to get the grease nipple off. I used a lot of wood blocks, and the reason for this is that the shafts and the sprockets are press fit together, and you're going to need to hammer really hard to get those bonds to break. You set the windlass up on the blocks, and then you can deliver all of your force directly onto the shafts. Be sure to use a rubber mallet, or this is, I think, polyurethane. Don't use a steel hammer on the ends of the brown shafts, because it would be very easy to damage the ends of those shafts. In order to get the sprockets out, also it was very helpful to have a bunch of different shims, because the inside of the case is tapered, and you need to shim the sides of the sprockets before you hammer. Also, PVC pipes and wood dowels are very helpful in driving the shafts all the way through the case. So hopefully those tips will help you have an easier time than I did. Maybe you'll get it done in less than a few days. Once all the pieces are out, it's time to decide how you want your case to look. Powder coating is usually the way to go, which is what we did here. Powder coating, the process is basically applies a charge to the paint powder and an opposite charge to the piece to get a really full, consistent thickness on the piece. And then once the paint is applied, it's baked in an oven, and it's really a resilient coating process. Should last for many years. During reassembly, it's good to be very careful of the new coating on your case. I thought by using scrap pieces of cardboard that would be good enough, but I learned the hard way that it wasn't. So I want to give you a recommendation now to put masking tape over this part of the windlass, and maybe even around the sides, because as you're reassembling all the components, you're going to be moving the whole unit around on its top and sides, and it's very easy for little pieces of dirt or sand to get between the cardboard and your case and scratch it, and we don't want to do that. So when we got our windlass, it seemed to work fine, but it wasn't installed on the boat, and there wasn't a really good way to test it under load. Although everything worked fine, I wanted to take it apart and clean everything. Eventually we got everything out, and I realized that the clutch cone, which is a phenolic laminated disc, the clutch cone had a slight tear in it, and it seemed to work fine, but just to be safe I ordered a new one. And since I was going to order this, I decided that it would be prudent to order there's 6 rubber O-rings and 6 rubber gaskets, just to have new ones of that. A new gasket for the bottom cover plate, and I got a couple of the pins that secure the clutch to the main axle. And also this goes into the Gypsy and helps remove road as the Gypsy spins. All these parts are available through a gentleman in Scotland who I believe used to work for the company. The company I think was bought out around the year 2000. These things, the parts are still available through him, and he ships them very quickly. From ordering to receiving the parts from Scotland to the United States only took like 2 or 3 days. It was remarkable how quickly he got the parts here. So that's everything I needed. I think I spent around a little over $100 on the parts, a few more bucks for the shipping, and so everything's clean and ready to be reassembled. So let's get to work. So the first thing that goes back in is the upper operating spindle, and that's where you slide your arm in and you winch the anchor back up. So there's 2 spindles. They're the exact same. This one's higher up, so that will go in first, and this one drives at a 1-to-1 ratio. The other one drives at a 2-to-1 ratio, so you're able to pick it up faster than this one. This one gives you more leverage. And so here's what goes in. We've got the spindle, an O-ring goes into the spindle, these bushes going into the case. This is the main part. There's a key that holds it on the axle, a bush on the other side that holds the other O-ring, another bush for the case, and then a washer and a bolt to hold it all together. Got the tools out. Here we just need the 17mm. So we'll flip this over, and as you can see, we installed the first bush. It didn't fit in as tightly as I had hoped. So what we used is some regular Teflon tape, plumber's Teflon tape. 2 passes around and it fits really tight. So we're going to do that with the next side. The operating spindle is tapered, and it has a keyway for the key that locks the sprocket onto the spindle. Now you have to keep in mind that the sprocket can only go on one way, and it gets press fit on. If you were to try to put it on the wrong way, it wouldn't even get onto the shaft. Now that the first operating spindle is in position with its sprocket in place on the key, we have to put the bronze bush in onto the shaft inside the bush on the case. Before we do that, we put the O-ring in, grease everything up. The next step in the process is to install the 2 ratchet shafts. These allow the windlass to work on a 1-to-1 ratio for greater leverage or a 2-to-1 ratio for greater speed. I wanted to point something out many of you will be following the schematic, and there's a shortcoming in that there's a ratchet bush spacer shown with a quantity of 2, and you'll have 2 of them, but in the schematic only 1 of them shown. And so I just wanted to point out that they both go on the lower shaft. And the reason for that is the lower shaft has more space inside because the inside of the case is tapered. The upper ratchet shaft has to go in from the starboard side because the spines are on this side, and you would have to force it through on the other side, which you don't want to do. So we'll just put it in from the starboard side. The next step, now that the ratchet shafts are temporarily in, is to put in the idler shaft. That's the fat shaft. And again, it has to go in the right direction, same as before. But there's another deficiency in the schematic. It doesn't show this small, thin washer. And that washer protects the inside of the case. And it goes on the starboard side, on the inside. Just something to keep in mind. After the idler shaft is installed, the next step is to put in the high-speed gear shaft, or high-speed gear and operating spindle. Now, if you remember, we left these first 3 shafts in loose, and that's a good thing because in order to fit this high-speed gear, this large gear in, we're going to have to just temporarily slide this lower ratchet shaft out of position so that the high-speed gear fits into the inside of the case. Shafts are tapered. They can only go on one direction. As I lower it in, I catch it with my other finger. It's through the opening in the case. And then I make sure it's set in the first spindle, operating spindle, set in its gear. Now I'm lining up the second operating spindle's key. Now I get the lower ratchet shaft back into place. Get the spacer. The other spacer. Get the wind up. And the shaft. It's going to help to push up a little bit on that spring. And now it's into the other side of the case. The final shaft to be installed is the main shaft, and it goes in from the starboard side, the same side as the chain pipe. And there's enough clearance inside the case for its sprocket to fit in without moving any of the other shafts. we have to keep in mind which direction the sprocket goes on the shaft. There's a right way and a wrong way, and you need to make sure that the shaft will fit in and have the right taper with the sprocket. So again, I catch it with my other finger. Get it lined up. I like to keep the key facing up where I can feel it. So in order to get the main shaft all the way through its bushes, it's a really tight fit, and you're going to have to tap the main shaft with a mallet. Make sure you use a rubber mallet so you don't damage the threads. So in order to get the main shaft pressed onto its sprocket, you need to use the winch drum, and it's a tight fit. So what I'm doing is just cooling off, getting the temperature of the main shaft very cold with ice, and then I'll heat the winch drum up with a little MAP gas. Before we press the winch drum all the way onto the main shaft, there's a clearance issue, so we need to install the idle shaft washer and bolt. You have to line up that hole with a hole in the main shaft. Once the clutch cone has been pressed onto the main shaft, you'll realize that the holes probably won't line up perfectly. And so what you can use are a couple punches and slide those into the shaft, into the cone, and then use the handle for the winch to pry it in whatever direction it needs to go. And then you get the holes aligned and you can drill through the other side of the clutch cone for inserting the spring pin. One of the last steps is to drive this spring pin through the clutch cone into the center of the main shaft. In order to do that, I've made a small dowel and marked a limit to how far to drive this in so that it's centered. You want this centered so that it transfers the shear force between the clutch cone and the main shaft. So we're gonna crimp the end of the spring pins just so it fits in a little easier. Spring pin is in. So the next thing to do is put the gypsy on, and its first order of business is to help us move the drum a little bit further onto the shaft. I think it needs to be pressed on just a little bit further, and I need to keep the shaft from rotating, and we'll be able to put the lock into good use. So it fits right on, and then here's the nut for it. And then we've got the lock. It goes right here. So with a locking pawl in place, we can keep the shaft from rotating and tighten the shaft into the drum on this side, and it should pull the shaft all the way through and make this align. You can see that gap closing now. Three steps left. First, we're going to install the grease nipple. It goes into the starboard side of the main shaft. And mine is tightened with a 7mm nut, which indicates that the whole unit was manufactured after 1983. The earlier ones were manufactured with a 13mm grease nipple nut. Next is the chain stripper. This is stainless steel, and it goes in from the bottom of the case. You want to make sure you do this before you go ahead and mount the windlass on your boat. The chain stripper is stainless steel and the case is aluminum, so there'll be some corrosion. There certainly was when I took mine apart. I had to drill out the set screw hole in order to get it out, and so I've retapped that, and I'll install a new bolt later. Finally, we'll put the cover plate and gasket on. My cover plate had a lot of corrosion on the inside, which I didn't anticipate, but I'm going to go ahead and make a new cover plate out of 1/8" thick stock aluminum plate, and I'll use the old one as a template. The last step is to install the grease, then the cover plate on the bottom. Now for grease, I'm using a marine style grease. It's a number 2 weight, which is pretty common, but I think really anything would probably work just fine. And I'm going to try to get as much in as possible with this grease gun. Now that the windlass is completely reassembled, it's time to talk about how it operates. In order to release the anchor, first pick up the pawl and set it down, and then using your hand or the control arm, back off this nut This allows the gypsy to come out of contact with the clutch cone, and it will rotate freely. And you can put down as much road and anchor chain as you would like. Then when you're satisfied, just tighten that back up by hand. It doesn't need to be very tight. Lock it in place with a pawl, and then it's always wise, I think, if you're going to leave the boat for any length of time, to have a snubber or a bridle taking the load rather than the windlass itself. Now when you're ready to pick the anchor back up, same thing goes. Take the pawl out of position. Then, using the control arm, it's good to start at the upper operating spindle. This will give you the most leverage. If you need to take up anchor faster, you can slide over to the other side and you'll go twice as fast. And you'll note that the gypsy will take in chain or anchor road in both directions that you're using the control arm. That's a really good feature. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions or suggestions, please comment below.